midnight in the North Atlantic. A Liberty ship heaves in the black waves, its hull shuddering with each crash of icy swell. The convoy's dim running lights are barely visible through mist and darkness. Suddenly, a flash on the horizon. An orange fireball blooms as a freighter in the distance takes a torpedo hit. The thunder of the explosion rolls across the sea. "Ship torpedoed, port side," comes the cry. The Liberty ship's crew scrambles to battle stations, boots thumping on steel decks slick with salt spray. Deck guns swing toward the unseen attacker. In the distance, a ship's whistle wails in distress. The ocean is alive with danger now, U-boat wolf-pack in the dark. Men grip their guns and scan the void, hearts pounding. They know they are the prey in these hostile waters, and the fight for survival has only begun. The scene could be any night in the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most critical campaign of World War II. For over 3 years, German U-boats had prowled these shipping lanes, determined to sever Britain's vital lifeline across the ocean. As an island nation, Britain required over 1 million tons of imported food, fuel, and supplies every week just to survive and fight. Hitler's strategy was to starve the UK into submission by sinking ships faster than the Allies could replace them. A grim war of numbers known as the Tonnage War. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, had even calculated that 300 U-boats could sink 1 million tons of shipping each month, enough to cripple the British economy. This was the German math behind the U-boat blockade, a ruthless arithmetic of ships built versus ships sunk. And early in the war, that math seemed to favor the Germans. By 1941, Allied shipping losses were catastrophic. In May 1941, U-boats were sinking merchant ships at over 3 times the rate British shipyards could build them. Winston Churchill himself, no stranger to mortal danger, confessed later that the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Britain was on the brink, without enough cargo ships to import food and munitions. Defeat loomed. But the Allies fought back with an unlikely weapon, the Liberty ship. In 1941, American shipyards began mass-producing these utilitarian cargo vessels under an emergency program. The Liberty ships were simple, hardy 10-knot freighters assembled from prefabricated sections by thousands of workers, including many women who'd never built ships before. What they lacked in glamour, they made up for in sheer numbers. 18 U.S. shipyards built 2,110 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945, an average of 3 new ships every 2 days. This surge of construction was unprecedented. The message was clear. The Allies intended to build ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. One dramatic example came in November 1942, when American industrialist Henry J. Kaiser set out to prove the point. His shipyard assembled the Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days and 15 hours from keel to launch, a world record. It was a publicity stunt, but also a powerful statement. The United States could replace ships faster than they could be sunk. The Liberty ships, humble, ugly ducklings of the sea, would be crucial to outrunning the Nazi torpedo math. By late 1942, the contest between Allied production and German destruction was at its peak. U-boats roamed in wolf packs, dozens of submarines lurking in long patrol lines across the North Atlantic approaches. That fall, Allied convoys laden with Liberty ships steamed into a gauntlet. In November 1942, Dönitz's submarines sank roughly 700,000 tons of Allied shipping in a single month, the heaviest losses of the entire war. Despite the influx of new ships, the Allied lifeline was strained to the breaking point. Each convoy sailing from America to Britain in those days was a deadly gamble, a race to deliver vital cargo before the U-boat's arithmetic caught up. March 1943. The Atlantic convoys reached their moment of crisis. The winter gales have abated, and German U-boat wolf packs seize the opportunity to attack en masse. That month proves to be the low point for the Allies, and the bloodiest for the merchant sailors. In mid-March, two converging convoys, HX-229 and SC-122s, are intercepted in what would become the largest convoy battle of the war. Over the course of 4 nightmarish days, 22 merchant ships are sent to the bottom under a flurry of torpedo strikes. Survivors in lifeboats watch in horror as ship after ship, tankers, freighters, troop ships, are blown apart or swallowed by the waves. The Germans exult that this is the greatest convoy battle of all time, with nearly 500,000 tons of Allied shipping destroyed in a single sustained operation. An Admiralty report somberly admits the Germans never came so near to disrupting communications between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March 1943. In other words, Britain's Atlantic lifeline was hanging by a thread. For the men aboard those convoys, the experience was harrowing. They endured constant fear, the heavy thump of torpedoes striking in the black of night, the sight of an oil tanker disappearing in a pillar of fire, the sound of hundreds of men crying out from frigid waters. One Royal Navy escort officer, Sub-Lieutenant Roy Dick Dykes, vividly described the agony of those moments. There's nothing more sorrowful or harrowing than to see a ship and to hear it sink. There are noises that come from a ship as if it's screaming as it sinks. Imagine hearing that scream echoing across the darkness, the death throes of a ship and her crew. Dykes's corvette, HMS Honeysuckle, could only pluck a few survivors from the debris-strewn seas. Many others were lost forever in the Atlantic black pit, the mid-ocean gap out of range of friendly aircraft, where help was often days away. Yet even in this darkest hour, the Allied response was stiffening. U-boat losses were mounting too. 12 submarines were destroyed in March 1943 and another 15 in April, an ominous sign for the Germans. New Allied technologies and tactics were finally coming into play. Long-range patrol bombers began to close the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort groups were reinforced with small escort carriers and very long-range B-24 Liberator patrol aircraft, bringing air cover to convoys in mid-ocean. Centimetric radar, a cutting-edge innovation, was now being installed on ships and planes. It could pick up a U-boat periscope or conning tower even in darkness or fog, nullifying the sub's former cloak of night. Convoy escorts also received new lethal tools, like the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that could hurl a pattern of contact-fused bombs ahead of a ship, pummeling a U-boat before it could slip away. And critically, Allied code breakers at Bletchley Park were reading German Enigma radio messages, helping to reroute convoys away from known U-boat wolf packs. The scales were starting to tip. All these developments would converge in one pivotal showdown, Convoy ONS-5. This was a slow westbound convoy, codenamed ONS-5, that departed the UK in late April 1943, bound for North America. It consisted of 42 merchant ships, many of them Liberty ships, escorted by a close escort of 16 British and Canadian warships. The men in this convoy were weary and on edge. They knew U-boats were massing to intercept them in the mid-Atlantic. Dönitz, desperate for a knockout blow, directed over 30 U-boats to concentrate against ONS-5. The convoy was sailing straight into the teeth of the largest Wolfpack attack yet seen. The battle for ONS-5 unfolded over 10 days of relentless tension. First came the weather. A raging force 10 gale lashed the convoy at the end of April. Mountains of water upended several ships. The convoy was scattered over 30 miles as the storm raged. Escorts struggled to keep contact as howling winds and 50-foot waves battered men and machines. One escort's crow's nest was literally filled with water by a towering wave. The destroyers burned precious fuel battling the seas. By the time the storm subsided on May 1st, some were running dangerously low on fuel. For a moment, the convoy's fate hung in the balance. If the escorts had to detach to refuel, The merchant ships would be sitting ducks, but they held on. As the weather cleared in the first days of May, the U-boats moved in. Night of May 4-5, 1943. The Wolfpack struck ONS-5 with full force. After days of cat and mouse, suddenly torpedoes were streaming in from all sides. In the darkness before dawn, explosions rocked the convoy one after another. The freighters, Harbury and Harperley, went down in quick succession. The American Liberty ship West Maximus took a torpedo hit and sank within minutes. The British freighter Bristol City was struck and broke apart, as did Wentworth. Amidst the chaos, an ammunition ship Lorient vanished with all hands. There was only a sudden flash on the horizon, then nothing. In a matter of hours, 8 ships were lost. The cold Atlantic was littered with burning wrecks, floating cargo, and men in the water clinging to rafts. The U-boats attacked aggressively, even surfacing among the convoy to pick targets in the darkness. The sea lit up with tracers as merchant ships' defensive guns fired back into the night. Yet this time, the prey began to bite back. The convoy's escorts, though stretched thin, responded with ferocity. Radar operators on the British destroyers HMS Vedette and HMS Loosestrife caught telltale blips on their screens. U-boats on the surface attempting to run ahead of the convoy. The escorts rushed toward the contacts. Star shells arced overhead, casting eerie illumination. On one flank, Vedette gained contact on a sub and drove it under, then saturated the dive point with depth charges, savaging U-boat U-514 and knocking it out of action. On the opposite flank, Loosestrife detected another U-boat and fired a pattern of hedgehog bombs in its path. A few heartbeats later, sailors heard dull underwater thumps, the sound of a direct hit. In the morning, they would find an oil slick marking the grave of U-192, blasted to pieces beneath the waves. Inside the convoy, the close escorts fought a desperate melee. The corvette HMS Sunflower churned through the debris of a freshly torpedoed ship and picked up a sonar, ASDIC, contact at close range. Sunflower's commander coolly ordered a depth charge attack. A pattern of 10 depth charges marched off her stern with resounding crumps. Moments later, shattered metal and air bubbled up. U-638 had been destroyed under Sunflower's onslaught. Elsewhere, the destroyer HMS Oribe detected U-boat U-125 stalking a straggler. Rather than let it escape, Oribe accelerated and rammed the U-boat amidships in a thunderous collision. Stunned, U-125 lay dead in the water with a crushed pressure hull. The submarine's captain ordered his crew to scuttle and abandon ship, knowing they were finished. In the cruel calculus of convoy battles, the escorts could not stop to rescue the German survivors. Oribe left them to the mercies of the sea as it rushed back to guard the convoy. The battle raged into the night of May 5-6. A thick fog bank rolled in after midnight, cloaking the convoy in a pale mist. In years past, such fog would have favored the U-boats, allowing them to close in unseen. But now it was the Allies who held the advantage. The new centimetric radar could see through the fog, while the U-boats' lookouts were effectively blind. One by one, the hunters became the hunted. Vedette picked up a radar contact at 5,000 yards and raced in, depth-charging a U-boat, likely U-531, that never saw the attacker. Loosestrife caught U-192 trying to creep up in the fog and blasted it with depth charges, sending it to the bottom. The sloop HMS Pelican and her support group arrived as reinforcement, and Pelican promptly nailed U-438 with a perfectly aimed salvo of charges, obliterating the sub early on May 6th. By dawn on May 6th, the Wolfpack had been beaten back in disarray. Dönitz reluctantly called off the assault on convoy ONS-5 that morning. The Battle of ONS-5 was an epic struggle. The convoy had been attacked by over 40 U-boats in total. The toll was severe. 13 merchant ships were lost, including several Liberty ships, a total of about 63,000 tons of shipping. Hundreds of sailors and crew died or went adrift on the open ocean. And yet, the German Wolf Pack paid a deadly price as well. At least 6 U-boats were confirmed destroyed and many more were damaged in the fight. The convoy's escorts, through courage and skill, had mastered the art of convoy defense. They proved that with sufficient escort ships, radar, air support, and aggressive tactics, a convoy could survive a mass U-boat attack and strike back hard. One Royal Navy historian, Stephen Roskill, later wrote that this 7-day battle against Dönitz's Wolf Pack, a battle unnamed and marked only by coordinates on a chart, was, in its own way, as decisive as Quiberon Bay or the Nile. It was the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. The immediate aftermath of convoy ONS-5 confirmed that the tide had indeed turned. Just 2 weeks later, another large convoy crossed the Atlantic without losing a single ship, despite repeated U-boat attacks. The escorts drove off every submarine and sank 3 in the process. It was an unprecedented success. May 1943 became known as Black May for the U-boat arm, as U-boat losses skyrocketed while Allied shipping losses plummeted. In that 1 month, 34 German U-boats were destroyed in the Atlantic, a disastrous rate that the Kriegsmarine could not sustain. After hearing the reports, Grand Admiral Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign, was despondent. A frightful total. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic, he wrote in his war diary. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz took the drastic step of withdrawing the remaining U-boats from the North Atlantic. The hunter-killer groups of Allied aircraft and escorts had made the mid-ocean too deadly for his submarines. The U-boats would eventually reappear in later months with new devices like snorkels and tactics, but never again would they threaten the Atlantic sea lanes as they had before. The critical supply line to Britain was effectively secured. For the Allied sailors, the naval escort crews and the civilian merchant marine alike, this turnaround was hard-won and came at a high cost. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest and arguably most brutal campaign of W.P., spanning September 1939 to May 1945. In those years, 3,500 Allied merchant ships and 175 warships were sunk in the Atlantic, victims of torpedoes, shell fire, bombs, and mines. Tens of thousands of men went down with those ships or died in the frigid seas. Between 1939 and 1945, an estimated 7,200 Allied sailors and merchant seamen lost their lives in the Atlantic struggle. The Germans, too, suffered horrendous casualties. Of 40,000 U-boat crewmen, 30,000, 3/4, were killed as their submarines were hunted down. The U-boat force, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was virtually annihilated by war's end. Around 783 U-boats were destroyed, their wrecks littering the ocean floor from the Bay of Biscay to the Arctic Circle. The Battle of the Atlantic truly became a war of attrition that Germany could not win. As one historian put it, British perseverance and American productivity overcame German aggression and technological skill. Liberty ships and the convoy system had outmatched the U-boat wolf packs. Crucially, Allied shipbuilding had outrun the German sinking rate. The German math of the tonnage war was proven wrong. Allied yards, especially in America, churned out new ships at astonishing speed. By 1943, new launches were far exceeding losses. In fact, by war's end, over 38 million tons of new Allied shipping had been built to replace losses. A gigantic armada of tankers, freighters, and troop ships that dwarfed the tonnage sunk by U-boats. The Liberty ships were the embodiment of that industrial triumph. Their production not only replaced what was lost, but eventually created an excess that allowed the Allies to expand their offensive operations. Starting in mid-1943, the Allies could pour troops and supplies across the Atlantic in ever-growing volumes. In 1943-44 alone, 3 million American and Allied soldiers were transported to Europe across the Atlantic. most on ships escorted safely by the now dominant Allied navies. This build-up of men and material would make possible the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944 and the liberation of Europe. None of it could have happened if the U-boats had prevailed in the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was a fight not just of ships and submarines, but of strategy, technology, courage, and production capacity. In the end, the Allies solved the U-boat threat by combining bravery and innovation at sea with assembly line efficiency on the home front. Every convoy battle, from the bleak days of 1941 to the turning point in May 1943, illustrated this deadly arithmetic. Liberty ships steamed into danger again and again, knowing some would never arrive. Escort sailors like Roy Dykes risked their lives nightly to protect them, listening to the ocean for the telltale echo of a U-boat, ready to pounce. It was a team effort spanning oceans and nations. And finally, by the spring of 1943, the equation shifted. Allied convoys, once decimated, were now arriving intact. The U-boats, once the hunters, became the hunted. The Liberty ships had effectively outrun German math. The rate of sinking could no longer keep up with the rate of building. Picture that foggy dawn in May 1943 as convoy ONS-5 survivors gaze about the grey Atlantic, wreckage and oil slicks on the water, but also the silhouettes of dozens of merchant ships still afloat and the escort ships standing guard, weary but victorious. Those seamen likely didn't realize it at the time, but they had just witnessed the turning of the tide in the Atlantic War. The Nazi U-boat strategy had been derailed. The arsenal of democracy was simply too strong. Liberty, in the form of stout, hastily built ships and the indomitable spirit of their crews, had outsailed and outfought tyranny's submarines. The Battle of the Atlantic was won, and with it, the path was clear for the final drive to victory in Europe. The day the Liberty ships outran German math was the day the Allies secured the lifeline of freedom.